Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. Yes, so this is the Lesbian Necromancers in Space book, which is still, in my opinion, possibly the greatest elevator pitch I have ever heard. Like, this is the holy grail of one-line sentences that inevitably draw people in. And unlike with Man Fuck This House, which was all good title and not a good book, there's a lot more to this book than the viral hook. So this book follows Gideon, who is actually not a necromancer. She is a foundling of the Ninth House, possibly the gothiest of the 9 houses under the Undying Emperor, the Necrolord. Gideon just wants to run off and join the army, be a swordswoman in the cohort, mainly just to get out from under control of the house that has never liked her and never seemed to know what to do with her. But right when she finally thinks she's going to escape, Harrowhark, the reverend daughter and heir to the house, gets called to the First House, the abandoned home planet of the Emperor, to attempt the dangerous task of becoming a new lictor. Lictors are the most powerful necromancers and the hands of the Emperor. But every necromancer needs a cavalier, a swordsperson to fight when and where the necromancer can't. And the Ninth House needs Gideon to step up and play Harrow's cavalier, though she was not trained nor raised for it and seems entirely unsuited. But Harrow promises her that if she plays her part well, Gideon will earn her freedom. The problem is, Harrow always lies. So this is an odd book. One of the first things I noticed about it is the book is a strange mix of highbrow and lowbrow. Like, a lot of the writing is surprisingly complex. There's a good bit of creative sentence structuring, there's imagery and reference to the classics, and I don't mean classics like fantasy novel classics like Lord of the Rings. I mean the classics like, Ovid and the Bible. But also, it was rare that I went a full chapter without having to pause and look a word up. And let me just tell you, I do not have a lot to hang my hat on in this world, but I am damn proud of my vocabulary. It is very rare for me to read anything that's not pure jargon and actually have to stop and look a word up. Yet this book found those words. But on the other side of that, the humor tends to be lowbrow puns, often sexual-based. The tone is conversational, and the main character is irreverent, not exceptionally intelligent, and not exactly introspective. Gideon is the type of hero I would expect to read in a very commercial fantasy novel. Maybe even the kind of young adult fantasy novel that Hollywood was determined to turn into a really bad movie like 5 years ago, if you remember those. But she actually appears in a book that is simply much more advanced writing than those books are. This is also one of those fantasy novels, and yes, I would say this is a fantasy novel. I do not think it's sci-fi, even though it takes place in space, nor horror, even though it takes place involving a lot of dead people. But this book features a world a lot bigger than can be introduced in one book. It actually sort of annoyed me how little of the greater universe was explored in the book when I was first reading. And I am still wondering how big this empire is, how it's ruled, how the houses interact, how necromancy is seen both in and outside of the empire, what is the war they are fighting, what exactly is the religion of the empire, and what is the religion of the Ninth House, what are the powers of the emperor, who the hell Gideon actually is, and so many other questions about the greater universe. This book is actually set up in such a way that it could be the perfect exposition machine, because the Ninth House is isolated from all the other houses and the rest of the empire, and Gideon is rather isolated within the Ninth House. And on top of that, she's set up as a character who seems aggressively disengaged from necromancy. This would be the perfect setup for her to be gradually learning about the world that she's been ignoring, and for us to learn about the world through her. And yeah, she is used that way a couple of times throughout the book, but more interesting, there's actually a moment that sort of reverses that, where she suddenly reveals that she is actually a lot more knowledgeable about necromancy, and specifically Harrow's necromancy, than she's been letting on throughout the book. But most of the exposition in general is a lot slower and more subtle. There's a lot that is left unexplained, and the gaps in our knowledge are clearly on purpose and not a mistake. The questions I've left were left in the book to leave us sort of drawn into the next one. They are designed to make us want to read more. And God, do I want to know more! I am really, really, really curious about the religion and morality of this world. Necromancy is almost always presented in books, especially fantasy books, as the magic of the evil. But here, their god, who is a clear Christ analogy, is a necromancer. And honestly, Christ analogies in fantasy are almost always secretly evil. Like, if you tell me you have an emperor who is a man that then became God and then became a man, I'm just gonna assume he is the secret villain behind everything. There's also a good bit of talk about the cohort of the army being sent into planets to sow death so that the necromancers have power to do their magic, which seems really not good. So this all leads me to the impression that this is going to be a series that really heavily deals with the main characters slowly realizing that their world and their society is evil. But if it is, we haven't gotten there yet. But that just makes me want to keep reading, to see what's coming, to see if my expectations here are met. And on that note, one of the things I found most impressive about this book was how often my expectations were subverted. Spoilers here. One example is I started out this book thinking it was going to be an enemies to lovers romance trope, and then I thought it was going to be enemies to lovers with a different character. Then I went back to the first character. Then I thought maybe not at all, but then I thought definitely not, and then I was like, yeah, it is, and then it was sort of, and then it was not. And while I am very, very, very glad we did not go there, I was surprised. And by the way, the reason I was really glad we did not go there is I do not particularly like the enemies to lovers trope, because in my mind, it often romanticizes abusive relationships. And if we had gone there with this book, spoilers, what it seemed like was happening was that Harrow and Gideon would end up together, and I mean, they sort of do, and there's definitely tension there, but they don't. It's not a romantic thing. But if we had gone there, yeah, their relationship is hella abusive. And yes, we find out throughout the book why the relationship is so dysfunctional, and their relationship definitely gets better, but in the end, it's not in a place that I'd be comfortable with giving them the happy, like, kissy lover's face ending. Like, that would make me very uncomfortable, so I'm glad that expectation was subverted. But, there's also other expectations I had throughout the book that were subverted, including which characters were going to die and when. So the author makes a passing joke in one of the appendices, and yes, this is a book I do encourage to read the appendices, because they are actually quite funny. But there's one character that she says she might as well have named Johnny Quickdeath. But the thing is, I did not actually recognize that reference when I was reading it. It went right by me. And most of the characters who she seems to think we were clearly, obviously going to notice were going to die soon, I did not. I didn't always see the deaths here coming. And I think that was largely because these are interesting characters. There are almost no red shirts in this book. The characters aren't all likable, and many of them are really heavily leaning into archetypes or stereotypes, but they are all almost instantaneously character. So, like, sometimes you're introduced to a character and, like, it's dozens of pages or even hundreds of pages of slowly building up who they are through the actions they take. Whereas other times you meet characters and you're just like, yep, one sentence description, I know exactly who the hell he is. And yeah, that's sort of what this book did. And it's not all surface level. There's a lot of character depth in these characters, but you get it very, very quickly. And it sort of sneaks up on you because it happens over a couple of dozen chapters, which I know I sound like I'm contradicting myself here, but the thing is, we're introduced to the bulk of the characters in this book in one moment, but we see them at a distance. We don't actually get to interact with all but one of them. And it's over the next couple of dozen pages that we spend time with them. We get to meet them in clusters. And those clusters are introduced in real quick, like, here's who this person is kind of characterization. And it worked really well. It prevented the book from having to have a major exposition dump when we're suddenly introduced to like 17 characters out of the blue. But at the same time, it also allowed it to feel like we were meeting these people, like we were getting to know them individually. Though, one quick side note here, the two characters that did not, in my opinion, get fully developed are the two soldier-type characters. They basically got stuck at the one-word, just character description kind of level. And this is mainly because it feels like Gideon just wasn't interested in them, which is downright hilarious because they are the perfect example of the life she thought she was running away to in the beginning of the book. Which, it was when I was writing this review that it occurred to me that that was on purpose, and that is clear symbolism for her gradual revelation that the cohort was not the life she was intended for. But overall, I would say that the way the exposition is handled may be the biggest coup of this book. Even though the remaining questions do nag me, and there's part of me still to this point going, like, you could have given us so much more. I think that the way the world is introduced here is really special. It's like peeking through a cracked door into a vast city. Some fantasy novels, when you read them, you get the feeling that the author mapped up just enough of the world for you to understand what is happening and know more. And the thing is, that's fine. We don't need to understand the complex court politics to follow the story of Terran in the Prydaean Chronicles. We don't need to know how many wizards exist in the world and how they interact with each other to understand the story of the Night Circus. Limiting the breadth of a world often allows an author to focus more on the character's growth, themes of personal journeys, and dynamics of families, friendships, and interpersonal relationships. It tends to make for smaller books, but sometimes the smaller books give us the best mirrors for ourselves. Then there are the books where the world is just absolutely huge, like excessively expansive, where we always feel like there's more just around the corner. And these are books like The Long Earth by Stephen Baxter and Terry Pratchett, or The Wheel of Time. These are books that are great for examining society, mob psychology, and how culture affects characters. But then there are books like this. This world we see is pretty small. Like, objectively, the entire book almost takes place on one small isolated planet, almost abandoned, with a character count under 20. But there are almost constant strings tying us to the world beyond, giving us little peeks of what is going on in the greater universe, and how they affect what's going on here. And the greater universe is clearly huge, and it's very clear that the author took the time to map out all of this world before she wrote a single word of this book. And that allows for a book that is very much centered on personal stories, but with these fascinating hints towards themes of religion, cultural morals, and duty. But I really like this book, even though it frankly has a lot of the tropes I absolutely hate. It has a super dark world with lots of violence, cruelty, and shittiness. The everything would have been so much easier if you had just fucking talked to each other moments that I hate in books. And it has the constant questioning of who can be trusted. All of whom are traits I despise. And yet I still loved it. And a lot of that is because Gideon made the perfect POV for this kind of book, in my opinion. Her irreverent bad jokes and detached yet caring voice kept things fun and human. The writing was interesting, the cast well balanced between likable and unlikable, the magic was explained just enough to keep me curious, and enough that I felt like I understood what was going on in the necromantic moments, without the book being bogged down in complex, jargon-filled BS. Some of the fight scenes were really cool, the imagery was across the board badass, and the world seemed really interesting. Also, Gideon the Ninth is just really fun to say, as are things like Necrolord, Harrowhark, and One Flesh, One End. And I know that seems like a really silly thing to point out in a book review, but the thing is, those really easy to say phrases allow the book to sort of get stuck in your head, to pop up when you are talking to other people. Like this book, I found myself throughout the time I was reading it wanting to talk about it to other people, wanting to bring it up in conversations. And that's a good way to keep a book selling. It makes me think that Tamsyn Muir is going to be an author I continue hearing about for a very long time. And I will be definitely picking up the next book, and honestly, I encourage you to pick up this one. Gideon the Ninth is a good book.